When the towers fell on September 11, 2001, investigators scrambled to identify the hijackers. Among the names that surfaced was Mohamed Atta, the ringleader who had piloted American Airlines Flight 11 into the North Tower. But in the chaos of those first hours and days, a different name kept appearing in intelligence databases and news reports. Mahmoud Mahmoud Atta, a terrorist, a bus bomber, a convicted murderer who had been serving a life sentence in Israel. Major news organizations, including the Boston Globe and the Los Angeles Times, reported that authorities believed the 9/11's hijacker Mohamed Atta was the same man who had ambushed a civilian bus in the West Bank in 1986. They said he had been released by Israel. They said he had slipped through American security despite being on a terrorist watch list. It made perfect sense, until it didn't. Because Mahmoud Mahmoud Atta and Mohamed Atta were two different men, born 14 years apart, from different countries, with different backgrounds, different faces, different lives. The confusion was eventually corrected. The media acknowledged the mistake. The public moved on. But here's what nobody seemed to notice. While everyone was focused on Mohamed Atta, the man who died in the North Tower, the other Atta, the real terrorist, the bus bomber, the man convicted of murder, simply vanished. His whereabouts are unknown. The official record states that the Israeli Supreme Court overturned his extradition on procedural grounds and set him free. But when? Where did he go? Is he alive? Is he dead? Nobody knows. Nobody seems to care. This is the story of a man who disappeared into history, not because he wanted to, not because he was good at hiding, but because everyone was looking at someone else with almost the same name. He was. Mahmoud Mahmoud Atta was born in 1954 in Jordan, making him 32 years old when he carried out the attack that would define his life. He was not Egyptian, like the 9/11's hijacker. He was not a student of architecture. He was not from a middle-class family seeking education in the West. Mahmoud was a militant. According to court documents and intelligence reports, he was associated with the Abu Nidal organization, one of the most feared terrorist groups operating in the Middle East during the 1970s and 1980s. The Abu Nidal organization, also known as the Fatah Revolutionary Council or the Arab Revolutionary Brigade, was responsible for attacks in more than 20 countries, killing hundreds of civilians. The group was notorious for its brutality and its willingness to target civilians. They didn't just attack military installations. They bombed airports, hijacked planes, assassinated diplomats, and murdered travelers. The organization operated out of Libya, Iraq, and Syria at various points, receiving state sponsorship and training. Mahmoud Mahmoud Atta was allegedly part of this network. Court testimony from his accomplices placed him as an operative who had received training and worked on behalf of the organization. He had reportedly been operating in Central and South America, setting up networks and conducting operations far from the Middle East conflict zones where most attention was focused. At some point, Mahmoud became a naturalized United States citizen. This fact is crucial and deeply troubling. A terrorist operative working for Abu Nidal somehow obtained American citizenship, which gave him the ability to travel freely, to establish a base of operations, to move between countries without the scrutiny that would have applied to someone traveling on a Jordanian or Palestinian passport. We don't know exactly when he became a US citizen, or how. We don't know if he lied on his application. We don't know if American intelligence agencies knew about his activities at the time he was naturalized, or if they only discovered his true nature after the bus attack. What we do know is that by 1986, Mahmoud Mahmoud Atta was living under his real name, moving freely despite being an active terrorist operative. And on April 12th of that year, he would commit an act of violence that would send him to an Israeli prison, at least for a while. The world around him. To understand the attack Mahmoud carried out, you have to understand the West Bank in 1986. The first Palestinian Intifada wouldn't begin until December 1987. But tensions were already building. The West Bank had been under Israeli occupation since the Six-Day War in 1967. 19 years of military control, checkpoints, and settlements expanding into Palestinian territory. The Palestine Liberation Organization was still operating from exile in Tunisia. Yasser Arafat was leading the mainstream PLO, but splinter groups like Abu Nidal's organization rejected any form of negotiation or recognition of Israel's right to exist. They wanted to destroy peace processes, to prevent any diplomatic solutions, to ensure that violence remained the only language of the conflict. Israeli buses traveling through the West Bank were frequent targets. These weren't military convoys. They were civilian buses carrying settlers between their homes and jobs, children going to school, families visiting relatives. The buses followed regular routes on known schedules. They were predictable. They were vulnerable. And groups like Abu Nidal knew it. The broader geopolitical context matters too. In 1986, the Cold War was still raging. The Soviet Union supported various Palestinian groups, while the United States backed Israel. Terrorist organizations could play these superpowers against each other, seeking refuge in states aligned with one side or the other. Libya, under Muammar Gaddafi, was openly hosting terrorist training camps. Syria provided safe haven to multiple militant groups. Iraq under Saddam Hussein did the same. These weren't secret operations. Everyone knew what was happening. But international law and practical politics made it difficult to stop. For someone like Mahmoud, this environment provided opportunities. He could move between countries, receive training, obtain funding and weapons, and carry out attacks with a reasonable expectation that he could escape and find sanctuary somewhere in the world. But on April 12, 1986, something went wrong. The attack. April 12, 1986. The West Bank, near Bet Lid Junction, close to Netanya. A civilian passenger bus was traveling along its regular route, carrying Israeli civilians through occupied territory. The exact number of passengers isn't entirely clear from all sources, but there were enough people on board that the attack would be remembered as particularly brutal. Mahmoud Mahmoud Atta, working with at least 2 accomplices, ambushed the bus. According to court documents and testimony from his co-conspirators, the attack was carefully planned. They didn't just open fire randomly. They used firebombs to stop the bus, then attacked with automatic weapons. The firebomb, likely a Molotov cocktail or similar improvised incendiary device, was thrown at or placed on the bus to force it to stop. As the vehicle came to a halt, Mahmoud opened fire with an Uzi submachine gun. The bus driver was killed immediately. At least 3 passengers were seriously wounded, with some sources indicating as many as 5 casualties. The shooting continued for what must have felt like an eternity for those trapped inside the bus. This wasn't a military target. There were no soldiers on the bus, no armed security, nothing that could be construed as a legitimate act of warfare. This was the deliberate murder of civilians going about their daily lives. The attackers fled the scene. Mahmoud somehow managed to escape the immediate area, despite Israeli security forces responding quickly. His 2 accomplices were captured relatively quickly and confessed to their participation. They named Mahmoud as the 3rd member of their cell. They described him as an operative of the Abu Nidal organization. They provided sworn testimony that would later be used in extradition proceedings. But Mahmoud was already gone. The escape to Venezuela. After the attack, Mahmoud fled the region entirely. He didn't try to hide in the West Bank or Gaza. He didn't seek refuge in Jordan or one of the neighboring Arab states. Instead, he traveled to Latin America. By June 1987, 14 months after the bus bombing, Mahmoud Mahmoud Atta arrived at Simón Bolívar International Airport in Venezuela, the country's main international gateway near Caracas. He had flown in from Mexico. Venezuelan intelligence, specifically DISIP, the Dirección de los Servicios de Inteligencia y Prevención, was watching him. They knew who he was. They had been tipped off, either by American intelligence, Israeli intelligence, or perhaps international police cooperation through Interpol. DISIP followed Mahmoud as he took a taxi from the airport to the city of Valencia in Carabobo state, about 2 hours from Caracas. Valencia is Venezuela's 3rd largest city, an industrial center with a significant population. It was the kind of place where someone could blend in, where money could be moved, where clandestine operations could be conducted. In Valencia, Mahmoud had contacts. High-level officials from the Abu Nidal organization were operating there. This is a crucial detail that's often glossed over in brief accounts of the case. The Abu Nidal organization had established a presence in Venezuela. They were conducting operations in Central and South America, far from the Middle East battlegrounds that typically dominated headlines. What were they doing in Venezuela? The court records describe Mahmoud as being responsible for Abu Nidal clandestine terrorist operations in Central and South American countries. Were they planning attacks in the region? Were they moving money? Were they establishing arms pipelines? Were they creating safe houses for operatives fleeing other regions? We don't know the full scope of their activities, but Venezuelan intelligence took them seriously enough to conduct surveillance. For 7 days, DISIP agents watched Mahmoud. They monitored his phone calls. They tracked his movements. They identified his contacts. They built a case. And then, on the 7th day, they raided the apartment where Mahmoud was staying. The raid was conducted by DISIP's commando unit, indicating they expected potential resistance. But the arrest went smoothly. Mahmoud was taken into custody and transferred to Caracas, the capital. Now Venezuelan authorities faced a problem. What to do with him? The extradition nightmare. Venezuela had no extradition treaty with Israel. This is a critical detail that would shape everything that followed. Israel wanted Mahmoud. They had evidence. They had testimony from his accomplices. They had the bus attack, with 1 dead and multiple wounded. They wanted him tried, convicted, and imprisoned for the rest of his life. But without an extradition treaty, Venezuela couldn't simply hand him over. They needed another solution. The solution they found was deportation. Mahmoud Mahmoud Atta was a naturalized United States citizen. He held an American passport. So Venezuelan authorities deported him, not to Israel, but to the United States, for immigration violations. This was clever legal maneuvering. Venezuela avoided the political complications of extraditing someone to Israel, a sensitive issue given Venezuela's relationships in the Arab world. But by deporting Mahmoud to the United States, they were putting him in a jurisdiction that did have an extradition treaty with Israel. On May 6, 1987, Mahmoud was placed on a commercial flight from Caracas to New York. FBI agents were waiting for him at John F. Kennedy International Airport. The moment he stepped off the plane onto American soil, he was arrested on an Israeli extradition warrant. The next day, May 7, 1987, he appeared before a U.S. magistrate. Israel's extradition request was on record. The legal battle was about to begin, and it would last for more than 3 years. The legal battle. Mohamed Mahmoud Atta hired lawyers and fought his extradition with every legal tool available. His primary argument was based on the nature of the U.S.-Israel extradition treaty. The treaty, like most extradition agreements, contained a political offense exception. Crimes of a political nature were not subject to extradition. The reasoning behind this provision is to prevent countries from using extradition to punish dissidents, freedom fighters, or political opposition. Mahmoud argued that the bus attack was a political act, not a criminal one. He claimed he was a freedom fighter resisting Israeli occupation. He maintained that attacking Israeli settlers in occupied territory was a legitimate act of resistance, not terrorism. His legal team also argued that he had been brought into the United States illegally. Since Venezuela had no authority to deport him to the U.S. under these circumstances, they claimed U.S. courts had no jurisdiction over him. This is sometimes called the Kerr-Frisbee doctrine, which holds that unlawful detention can void jurisdiction in some cases. The first magistrate hearing his case, Magistrate Caden, actually agreed with him. On June 17, 1988, Magistrate Caden denied Israel's extradition request. He reasoned that the alleged attack was indeed a political act covered by the treaty exception. He also found that Mahmoud had been brought into the United States improperly, which voided U.S. jurisdiction. Israel and the U.S. government appealed. The case went before District Judge Edward R. Corman of the Eastern District of New York. Judge Corman reviewed the evidence, the testimony, the legal arguments, and the broader policy implications. Judge Corman reversed the magistrate's decision. His reasoning was detailed and forceful. First, he addressed the political offense exception. Judge Corman examined the nature of the attack. This wasn't a military operation against soldiers. This wasn't sabotage of military equipment. This was the deliberate targeting of civilian passengers on a bus. One of the key principles in determining whether an act qualifies as a political offense is whether it targets civilians versus military targets. Judge Corman wrote extensively about how terrorism against civilians cannot be protected as political speech or resistance. He noted that current U.S. policy on terrorism must inform how courts interpret treaties. He emphasized that the threat of terrorism to peaceful civilian life was so great that either the political offense exception needed to be limited, or terrorist acts needed to be placed outside its protection entirely. The court found that Mahmoud's attack was not a political offense. It was murder. It was attempted murder. It was terrorism, pure and simple. Second, Judge Corman addressed the jurisdictional argument. While he acknowledged the complexities of how Mahmoud had been brought to the United States, he determined that the deportation from Venezuela to the U.S. was lawful under the circumstances, and that U.S. courts did have jurisdiction. On December 14, 1989, Judge Corman ordered that Mahmoud Mahmoud Atta be extradited to Israel to stand trial, but the legal battle still wasn't over. Mahmoud appealed again. this time seeking a writ of habeas corpus to prevent his extradition. The case, Ahmad v. Wiegand, went before a different court. Finally, in October 1990, after more than 3 years in U.S. custody fighting extradition, Mahmoud Mahmoud Atta was put on a plane to Israel. The extradition warrant was signed by Deputy Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger. He arrived in Israel on November 2, 1990. Trial and conviction. The Israeli legal system moved relatively quickly once Mahmoud was in custody. In October 1991, almost exactly 1 year after his arrival in Israel, an Israeli court found Mahmoud Mahmoud Atta guilty of murder and attempted murder for the April 12, 1986 bus attack. The evidence against him was substantial. His 2 accomplices had confessed and provided detailed testimony about his role in planning and executing the attack. They described how the operation was carried out. They identified Mahmoud as the one who opened fire with the Uzi. They confirmed that all 3 of them were working for the Abu Nidal organization. Ballistic evidence tied one of the accomplices' weapons to the scene. The testimony was corroborated by Israeli documents, by Mahmoud's passport showing his travels, by details that matched the accomplice's statements independently. The court convicted him and sentenced him to life in prison. Different sources give slightly different versions of the sentence. Some say life imprisonment, others mention 25 years. One account specifically states that he was initially sentenced to life, and sources from as late as 1993 describe him as still serving that life sentence in an Israeli prison. For several years it appeared the case was closed. Mahmoud Mahmoud Atta was behind bars in Israel, where he would presumably spend the rest of his life. But then something changed. The moment, everything shifts. The Israeli Supreme Court intervened. According to the Jerusalem Post and other sources, the Israeli Supreme Court eventually overturned Mahmoud's extradition. The ruling found faults in the extradition process. This is where the public record becomes frustratingly vague. What faults? When did this happen? What specific procedural errors did the Supreme Court identify? Was it the 3-year delay in the U.S.? Was it some aspect of the Venezuelan deportation? Was it a technicality in how the extradition warrant was executed? The sources don't say, or if they do, those details haven't been widely reported. What we know for certain is that the Supreme Court's ruling resulted in Mahmoud being released from prison. The Jerusalem Post article from 2001 states that Mohamed Atta was eventually freed after the Supreme Court ruled there were faults in the extradition process. But it doesn't specify when this occurred. Here's what makes this particularly strange. Newspaper accounts from as late as 1993 still described Mahmoud Mahmoud Atta as serving a life sentence in an Israeli prison. This suggests the Supreme Court's reversal didn't happen until sometime in the mid to late 1990s. But the exact date is unclear. The circumstances of his release are unclear. What happened next is completely unknown. The article concludes with one simple haunting statement. His whereabouts today are unknown. Then came 9/11s. Fast forward to September 11, 2001, when investigators began piecing together the identities of the 19 hijackers. The name Mohamed Atta appeared. Born September 1, 1968, in Egypt, 33 years old, an architecture student who had lived in Germany, the operational leader of the plot, the pilot of American Airlines Flight 11, which struck the North Tower at 8:46 a.m. But as information flooded in from intelligence databases, another name surfaced. Mahmoud Mahmoud Atta, also spelled Mahmoud Abed Atta. Born in 1954 in Jordan, a convicted terrorist, a bus bomber from 1986. The names were similar enough that confusion was almost inevitable. Major news organizations began reporting that Mohamed Atta, the 9/11's hijacker, was the same person as Mahmoud Atta, the bus bomber. They reported that he had been on terrorist watch lists since 1986. They questioned how someone with that history could have entered the United States multiple times on a visa. The Boston Globe reported it. The Los Angeles Times reported it. Other outlets followed suit. Even some government sources seemed to be operating under this assumption initially. It made sense on the surface. A terrorist named Atta had attacked civilians in the past. Now another terrorist named Atta had attacked civilians again, on a much larger scale. The narrative fit together too neatly, but it was wrong. The confusion was eventually cleared up. Court records from the Second Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals showed that Mahmoud and Mohammed were two different people, born 14 years apart, from different countries, with different backgrounds. The Boston Globe issued a correction. Last week, many news organizations, including the Boston Globe, reported that U.S. authorities believed Atta had attacked a commercial bus in Israel in 1986. But Second Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals records show that was a case of mistaken identity. Another man, a naturalized U.S. citizen who used the alias of Mahmoud Atta, was arrested in that attack. Snopes, the fact-checking website, published a detailed article debunking the confusion. Wikipedia articles for both men clarified the distinction. The public record was corrected. The mistake was acknowledged. But in all the attention paid to Mohamed Atta, the men who flew into the North Tower, almost nobody paid attention to what had happened to the other Atta. The investigation that never was. Think about what should have happened in the weeks and months after 9/11. Intelligence agencies around the world were in a panic. How had this happened? Who had missed what signals? Were there other cells operating? Were more attacks coming? Every name, every connection, every piece of intelligence was being scrutinized. The CIA, FBI, Mossad, MI6, and dozens of other agencies were sharing information, following leads, interrogating suspects. When the Mahmoud Mahmoud Atta confusion emerged, it should have triggered immediate questions. Where is the other Atta, the real terrorist from 1986? He was released by Israel at some point. When? Where did he go? Is he still alive? Did he maintain contact with Abu Nidal operatives? Could he possibly have connections to Al-Qaeda? These would have been reasonable, even obvious questions to ask. After all, here was a convicted terrorist with a nearly identical name to the 9/11's ringleader. Even if they weren't the same person, the coincidence alone warranted investigation. But there's no public evidence that any such investigation took place. Or if it did, the results were never made public. The Jerusalem Post article from November 2001, published just 2 months after 9/11, stated plainly, "His whereabouts today are unknown." That's it. No indication that Israeli authorities were looking for him. No suggestion that American agencies were trying to track him down. Just an acknowledgement that nobody knew where he was. This is extraordinary. A convicted murderer who attacked a civilian bus, who was associated with one of the world's most dangerous terrorist organizations, who somehow had his conviction overturned and was released, and who shares an almost identical name with the most infamous terrorist in modern history, has disappeared without anyone seeming to care. Why wasn't there a manhunt? Why wasn't his face on wanted posters? Why wasn't there international cooperation to locate him? The most charitable explanation is that intelligence agencies did investigate, did track him down, did determine he posed no threat, and simply chose not to make that information public for security reasons. This happens. Not everything intelligence agencies know becomes public knowledge. But the alternative explanation is more troubling. In the chaos of 9/11 and its aftermath, with everyone focused on Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, Mahmoud Mahmoud Atta simply fell through the cracks. He became a footnote, a case of mistaken identity that was corrected and then forgotten. The details that won't let go. Let's talk about what we don't know, because the gaps in this story are as significant as the facts. We don't know when the Israeli Supreme Court overturned Mahmoud's extradition. Was it 1994, 1996, 1998? The vagueness is striking. A Supreme Court ruling overturning a terrorism conviction should be a matter of public record with specific dates, but those details are absent from every accessible source. We don't know the specific legal reasoning the Supreme Court used. What were the faults in the extradition process? Were they so technical that a convicted murderer had to be set free? Or was there something more substantive, some serious violation of his rights that made the conviction untenable? We don't know if Mahmoud remained in Israel after his release, or if he left immediately. A man convicted of attacking Israeli civilians and connected to a terrorist organization would presumably have been monitored closely. Did Israeli intelligence keep tabs on him? Did they lose track of him? Did they even try to follow him? We don't know if he returned to the United States. He was still, as far as we know, a naturalized U.S. citizen. Did he have a valid passport? Could he have re-entered the country? After everything that happened, the extradition, the conviction, the release, would the U.S. have allowed him back in? We don't know if the Abu Nidal organization maintained contact with him. The organization continued operating through the 1990s, though it had been weakened by various factors, including internal purges and international pressure. Abu Nidal himself was found dead in Baghdad in 2002, officially by suicide, though many suspect he was killed. But other operatives continued activities for years. Was Mahmoud one of them? We don't know if he changed his name. After all the publicity, after the 9/11's confusion, anyone with the name Mahmoud Mahmoud Atta would have faced intense scrutiny. It would have been logical to assume a new identity, to disappear into a new life under a different name. We don't know if he's alive or dead. If Mahmoud was born in 1954, he would be 71 years old now in 2025. That's not old enough that we can assume he's dead. He could still be alive somewhere, living quietly, his past buried under layers of time and confusion. And perhaps most disturbingly, we don't know if anyone in authority actually cares. Theories and speculation. In the absence of concrete information, we're left with theories. None of them can be confirmed, but all of them are plausible. Theory 1. He's dead. The simplest explanation is that Mahmoud Mahmoud Atta died sometime in the 1990s or early 2000s, and nobody noticed because nobody was looking for him. He could have died of natural causes. He could have been killed by former associates who viewed him as a liability after his arrest and testimony from his accomplices. He could have been assassinated by Israeli intelligence in a quiet operation that was never made public. If he died anonymously, under a different name, or in a country where his true identity wasn't known, there would be no death record connecting to the name Mahmoud Mahmoud Atta. He would simply disappear from history. This theory would explain the complete absence of any sightings, arrests, or intelligence reports about him. Dead men leave no trail. Theory 2. He changed identity and disappeared. More interesting is the possibility that Mahmoud is still alive but living under a completely different identity. After his release, he could have obtained false documents, adopted a new name, and started over somewhere far from Israel and the United States. The 1990s were a good time to disappear. The internet was in its infancy. Facial recognition technology didn't exist. International databases weren't interconnected the way they are now. With the right documents and enough cash, a person could vanish into a new life. If Mahmoud had connections through the Abu Nidal organization, they could have provided him with a new identity, smuggled him to a safe location, and set him up to live quietly. Many former terrorists from that era did exactly that, fading into obscurity in countries that didn't cooperate closely with Western intelligence. Theory 3. He returned to terrorism. The darkest theory is that Mahmoud went back to doing what he knew how to do: terrorist operations. Perhaps he reconnected with former associates. Perhaps he offered his services to other groups. Perhaps he continued working in the shadows, planning or facilitating attacks that were never connected back to him. This seems less likely given his age and the attention his name would attract, but it can't be ruled out entirely. Experienced operatives are valuable. Someone with Mahmoud's background, his training, his connections, wouldn't just be cast aside. If he wanted back in, there would have been groups willing to take him. Theory 4. He's living openly somewhere that doesn't care. This might seem impossible, but consider, how many people actually remember the name Mahmoud Mahmoud Atta? Outside of intelligence circles and people who followed the 9/11's confusion closely, almost nobody. If he's living in a country that doesn't have close ties to Israel or the United States, using his real name, he might be completely safe simply because nobody around him knows who he is or what he did. Some countries don't extradite their own citizens. Some countries actively harbor former militants. If Mahmoud ended up in one of those places, he could be living openly, confident that no one will come for him.